It's weird to think that after nearly 40 years of making video games, the gaming industry hasn't really worked out the best way of teaching someone how to play them. When things were simple and you only had a couple of buttons to press, you didn't need a lot of help, but now things have gotten more complicated and they've done away with the instruction manuals, there's more pressure on the in-game tutorial to teach you how to play, and to do so in a way that makes me want to continue playing afterwards. So many games are bad at this, even good ones. There is an argument to be made that the presence of any kind of traditional tutorial is something to be ashamed of, since it's a lot more fun and effective to learn by doing, but while the romantics among us wish for more games like Mega Man X and Metroid that say so much with very few lines of text, this isn't always possible. However, I still think that you can have good tutorials that explain things clearly and concisely. I'm not going to talk about that today. It's also worth considering the absence of a tutorial and whether or not removing that feature is justified, because in a perfect world, there are no tutorials, or at least no moments where you're clearly being told how the game works. But if you need a tutorial, fucking use one. Please make it good. The opening minutes and hours of an RPG are a dangerous game. Unlike a lot of other genres, you've got a hefty amount of exposition and scene setting to wade through before you get into the meat of the game. There's almost an arrogance that comes with it, almost to say, you're gonna pay attention to all this world building and also tutorials, or you're gonna be very lost later down the line. This has spilled over into other games like Twilight Princess, which is more of a tutorial disguised as a chunky prologue, but I think that's fine as long as you're keeping everything reasonably exciting. Kingdom Hearts has a history of struggling in this department, but it never got quite as bad as in Kingdom Hearts 2. There's a lot to this game, and it sometimes feels like most of it is prologue. You probably shouldn't make games like that. It's not too bad though, since Kingdom Hearts 2 does use its educational prologue to introduce Roxas as an important character within the plot, and giving you a chance to play as him is a good way of endearing his character to the player. The fact that after Twilight Town you go back to controlling Sora and continue on as normal is slightly reminiscent of Metal Gear Solid 2, putting you in charge of Raiden after its prologue, but backwards. The difference here is that MGS2 gives you a far more engaging intro with tutorials kept to a minimum and actual things happening. Snake fucking dies in the intro, that's enough to keep a player engaged. A large part of Kingdom Hearts 2's opening feels like the game is stalling for time so you can play around with Roxas some more. Unfortunately, you don't spend a lot of time doing what this series does best, which is the combat, and instead you talk to NPCs and do random jobs and generally wade through 6 days of lethargic tutorials. That being said, it does do a good job of teaching combat in a way that escalates with every subsequent fight and feels like you're making the kind of tangible progress that every other part of the prologue fails with. To be fair though, there is a lot of game and you wouldn't like it if you didn't understand it. I just wish it got on with it. I have a hypothetical question for you, Internet. What is worse? A tutorial that is unnecessarily lengthy, that goes on for hours, and is unskippable, or a tutorial that ultimately does not teach you how to play the video game? It's interesting to think about. It's also less of a hypothetical question and more of a trick one, because there is indeed a third option. I didn't even know this was a thing before I started doing research, but apparently there's a bunch of games where people struggle to get through the tutorial at the start. Okay, I did know this was a thing. If anything, it shows how hard it is to make a good tutorial, especially if you have wildly unrealistic expectations of the player's abilities shortly after they've booted the game up for the first time. Getting stuck on the tutorial for any reason does not bode well, but not quite as much as The Witcher 2, which is somewhat infamous for having an unforgiving tutorial section at the start. It also recommends you a difficulty setting based on your performance. Please don't judge me, video game, we barely know each other. What I like is that The Witcher 2 does try and frame its tutorial within the context of a competition. Naturally, you get plenty of panels telling you how a mouse works and how to sit on the floor and wait for time to pass, but where this section falls over is actually when it gets into combat. But not this version. You see, while it's handy that this arena tutorial exists and teaches you how to fight people, it was only patched in as part of the enhanced version re-release. Standard The Witcher 2 threw you into a world with very little information other than a naked lady to sleep next to, and expected you to understand how a fairly complex combat system worked, in an environment where you're slightly too overwhelmed to do anything other than mash buttons. It might feel a little patronizing when the enhanced version recommends a difficulty setting for you based on your showing in the arena, but it's a lot better than flailing around trying to understand how to riposte with the right timing. Put me in that arena, have that guy shout abuse at me, and tell me that despite fighting off waves of enemies, that easy is the right setting for me. Because I sure as hell don't want to learn through the other way. I do not perform well under pressure. I don't envy having to make new games for lengthy ongoing franchises, since introducing new features is part of the same territory as explaining existing mechanics to newcomers. As a consequence, the tutorials end up jumping between the two to cover all the bases and to ensure that no one gets left behind, even at the cost of maybe boring long-time fans to a slow, agonizing death. Pokemon Sun and Moon were billed as being a dramatic step in a new direction for the Pokemon series, and naturally, you need to explain how these new, not quite gym leaders work, and what's up with the ride Pokemon, but could you get on with it, please? I've got weird creatures to catch, I don't even know what this is. It's probably not the best idea to dedicate an entire island to tutorials, because that is a hefty amount of time spent learning something that isn't even all that complicated. You know, Pokemon shuffled around some ideas in Sun and Moon, but it still has the same basic battle mechanics and should be immediately familiar to anyone who's played Pokemon in the last decade. I get it that Nintendo want to appeal to people who either haven't played Pokemon at all or not for a long time, but I think there's better ways of doing it than forcing everyone through a very slow opening where NPCs spout off tutorials interlaced with exposition, and I find it very hard to care about the opening few hours of Sun and Moon. But hey, that's fine, we all make mistakes sometimes, but as The Witcher 2 has shown, that is why we have enhanced versions. Did Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon change much? Not really. Even though a common source of complaints in the originals was the lengthy tutorials, the Ultra games did very little to change any of that. They did add Mantine surfing though, so I guess everything's perfect now. Hold on to those little victories. I understand the need to dumb it down to the common denominator to make sure that everyone knows what's going on, but all that Pokemon Sun and Moon needed was an option at the start to say that you have extensive playing experience of a Pokemon game, and therefore you can kind of skip quite a lot of the tutorials, and mostly the patronizing trainer school, where, you know, you get rid of that is 35 to 40 minutes of fun time later down the line. These games needed some quickness to them. The ways in which tutorials end up being implemented goes against most of how video games work. Every little nugget of knowledge about game design will tell you to stay away from repetition, but you kind of need that in order to teach a player how to play the game in the first place. The same logic applies on a broader scale with genres. Maybe you'd like to make that groundbreaking, cliche-busting magnum opus, but you'd have to go through the difficult process of teaching the player how to play this strange new game. Or, you know, you could just make another generic shooter instead. Most of the work's already done for you. There's other problems associated with making an FPS game as risk-free and as safe as possible, like shipping over 100,000 units, but everyone will know how to play it. You run around, you shoot the bad guys, you win a thing, and, you know, positive gaming experience. It's very easy. You can change things up though, to make your game more desirable, but you absolutely have to let everybody know what's going on. Otherwise, you will start running into a lot of problems. It's easy to forget that there was a time when Team Fortress 2 was basically all we had for stylized, class-based multiplayer shooters, which makes it surprising when you realize how little effort Valve put in to teach new players what the hell is going on here. You might think, hey, it's not so complicated, you just point and click and shoot the other guys, but there are in fact many classes that do not work like that. Really, none of the 9 classes operate in a similar fashion to anything from Call of Duty, and yet, with so many intricate details to consider, a new new player's best source of information is the bare bones training mode that has spent most of the time being broken. Apart from that, you've got some loading screen tips, and I guess just fighting against the steep learning curve and hoping that you pick up how to get the most out of the pyro, or how to rocket jump as soldier, or even how to form a good team composition. I feel like that should be the first thing you learn. There's a guy who heals people, and a guy who kills people in one shot? Team Fortress 2 is crazy, man. The issue with determining a gold standard for video game tutorials is that everyone learns things in different ways and at different paces. I remember that back in the day my school ran this survey to determine what kind of learners all the pupils were, and apparently I'm an auditory learner, which just means that I retain information better if I hear it aloud. But then you've got visual and kinetic learners who pick things up by seeing and doing things, so it's hard work making a tutorial that does all things for all people. Though there was a Star Wars film that recently said that failure is the best teacher, and usually I'd agree, but I've also played Driver before, so I'm more inclined to disagree. And the reward for the most unnecessarily difficult tutorial goes to a PS1 driving game, because that is where you'd go to satiate your powerful desire to be challenged in weird and unusual ways. Driver is actually a really fun open world game that predates Grand Theft Auto by a couple of years, and it naturally has a strong focus on driving. As a means of integrating the tutorial into the story, your character is trying to show off his driving skills to a local crime boss by performing advanced maneuvers in a car park. You've got 60 seconds to buy all of these items on your shopping list, and hitting 4 things will wreck the car, forcing you to start over from the beginning. Does that sound simple? It's not supposed to be. For whatever reason, Driver expects you to have a supreme level of car control despite having never played it before. Hell, this game came out only 2 years after the first Gran Turismo game, so it wasn't like this knowledge was part of the general consciousness at this point. It's unforgiving and honestly not as fun as any other part of the game, but it is doable if you go into it with a plan and a route mapped out ahead of time. But that's just it, isn't it? If you need to prepare in advance in order to beat a game's tutorial stage, I'd say the developers might have the wrong idea of what a tutorial is supposed to do. Oh, no, clearly it's supposed to beat the player into the ground until they learn how to not crash that car. What's a boy to do? This is RabbidLuigi, and if you think about it, Driver's tutorial level is kind of like an acid test in a way. If you put the hardest level in the game at the start of the game, then you know for sure that any player who passes that is going to be as prepared as physically possible for the rest of the game, because the rest of the game, by comparison, is incredibly easy. So all they really need to do now is actually give me some useful information in that tutorial, which can be very helpful for me for the rest of my adventures. I'm really good at slaloms though. Have you got an idea that you'd like me to turn into a countdown? Let me know in a comment down below, and make sure you check out my Twitter, where I'll be turning the best submissions into a poll where you can then decide the best topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.